Hi sewing friends, today we're actually going to be talking about bias tape, also known as bias binding. Now what is bias tape? It's a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias, usually at a 45-degree angle, and it's used to complete the edges of necklines and armholes. There are many different types of bias tapes, and we're going to discuss some of them today. Now let's talk about single fold and double fold bias tape. Single fold bias tape is typically used for the simple edge finishing with both edges pressed to the center, and some of the common widths for single fold bias tape is 1/2 inch to 1 inch. This I have in my hand is actually single fold. Double fold bias tape now is folded in half and then folded again along the center crease, so it encloses the raw edges. This type of bias tape is often used for more substantial edge finishes like on quilts or to finish the edges of clothing and home decor projects. It commonly comes in 1/4 to 1/2 inch widths. The colorful one on the left is the single fold. As you can see, the long edges are pressed in half, and single fold can also become double fold by just folding it and pressing it again. Now let's measure the width of the actual bias tape before it's folded to get an idea of what we are working with. This particular one measures about 1 3/4 in width. So they will fold it in half, press it and open the press, and then fold in the long edges, press, and then fold it one more time to make it into what we have here, 1/2 inch bias tape. This one is actually a cotton bias tape, and they're all cut on the 45-degree angle to get the stretch in the fabric. Let's measure this single fold bias tape. This one measures 1 7/8, and once folded it is 1 inch wide. Once pressed, it's 1 inch wide. If we should fold it again, it will now become a 1/2 inch double fold bias tape. Here again we have another single fold that is 2 inches wide. When it's pressed, it becomes 1 inch wide, and if we should fold it again, it becomes 1/2 inch and now becomes double fold bias tape. Here we have a thin pink cotton bias tape. If we should open the entire bias tape and measure it, this one measures 1 inch wide. With the edges folded in, it measures 1/2 inch wide. And when it becomes double fold bias tape, it is a 1/4 inch wide. This one was store-bought. They're all store-bought. So we're now going to attempt to apply a single fold bias tape to the neckline of a bodice. I have my bodice back pieces and front pieces sewn together at the shoulder. Now you can pin the bias tape either on the right side or the wrong side of the bodice, depending on the look you're going for. I'm going to pin it on the wrong side so that when I flip it over, it goes and shows on the right side of the fabric. The first thing is to open one of the long ends of the bias tape, and we're going to pin it to the neckline. Once we have pinned it, we are now going to sew using the crease in the bias tape as our sewing guide. Once the bias tape is sewn, we are going to fold the bias tape over to the right side of the fabric. Now you can fold it as a single fold bias tape by just folding over the entire bias tape to the right side of the fabric, or you can fold it so that half of it shows on either side of the fabric. So before we finish attaching the bias tape, we are going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch so that we will reduce bulk under the bias tape. As you can see, on the wrong side it's a nice clean finish, but you'll have a nice red binding around your neckline from the right side of the fabric. You can also just fold it halfway, as I'm showing you here, so that you have a nice clean finish still on both sides, but the binding will be visible on both the right and the wrong side. In this case, when you're sewing it, you will sew just at where the previous seam line is, just below the bias tape. So your bias tape will cover the seam line and you'll sew like 1/8 inch from the edge of the bias tape. So as you can see, I used black thread so that it would be more visible to you. I have completed the attachment of the bias binding. I used half of it to show on the right side and on the wrong side so that I have a contrast color on my neckline. So now we're going to show you how to apply the bias tape to the armhole of a bodice. The first thing we'll do is locate the side seam of the bodice, take our bias tape, fold the short edge in by about 1/2 inch and pin it to the seam of the armhole, the side seam. Pin the bias tape and the armhole together, aligning the raw edges. Once you get back to your starting point, you're going to overlap your bias tape by about 1/2 inch and trim off any excess bias tape. Overlap the two ends of the bias tape as shown here. And then sew the bias tape to the armhole using the crease mark in the bias tape as your guide. Here I have the bias tape sewn to the armhole. We are going to trim the seam allowance down by about 1/4 inch to reduce bulk. Next, we are going to fold our bias tape over to the wrong side of the bodice. In my case, it's to the wrong side. It depends on how you attached it. And we're going to use the bias tape to cover the raw edges and place the folded edge of the bias tape just on the seam line, the previously stitched seam line. You can fold the bias tape once more so that none of it shows on the right side of the garment. Once you get back to your starting point, you're going to overlap your bias tape by about 1/2 inch and trim off any excess bias tape. Overlap the two ends of the bias tape as shown here, and then sew the bias tape to the armhole using the crease mark in the bias tape as your guide. So here I'm showing you the bias tape fully sewn on and attached to the armhole. The entire bias tape is on the inside, and the armhole on the right side of the fabric is very clean and neat. Now I'm going to show you how to attach the bias tape in a different way. This time we are going to open up all the creases on the bias tape and fold it in half. Pin the bias tape to either the armhole or the neckline, aligning all the raw edges. Then you're going to sew the bias tape to the neckline using the crease mark as your guide. So here I have my bias tape fully pinned, and I'm going to trim off any excess, and I'm going to sew using the crease line as my guide. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. The next step is to understitch the bias tape to the seam that's left at the neck. Understitching will ensure that the bias tape doesn't peek out from the right side of the garment. So what we're going to do is press the seam allowance upwards to the bias tape and sew on the seam allowance and the bias tape. So this is the result. Now we're going to fold the bias tape towards the wrong side of the fabric and pin. Once it's sewn, the bias tape is fully on the wrong side of the fabric, and there is no evidence from the right side that your bodice is being finished with bias binding. It's nice and clean on the right side.